Okay, and I'm recording as well. So great. Thank you very much, Terry, for coming along to this. So this is the Take the Power Back session for the National Sustainable Living Festival of 2021. I'm Gordon Young. We've already sort of introduced ourselves, but I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today in our various locations. I'd also like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge any Aboriginal people here today. Coming from the US, this is probably a bit of an odd sort of ritual you would have seen done a lot of times with the SLF, but it's quickly becoming mainstream. Well, it is mainstream over here for the most part, it's good progress, right?
Yes.
Background, as we've already discussed, ethics consultant. I lecture at RMIT, environmental management, local government has been a big focus of that, international development. And a lot of what we're going to be doing, well, pretty much all of what we're going to be covering off today is based on this book, all right, which I'll provide a link to you at a later stage. So a lot of the case studies I'm going to use today are probably not going to be familiar with, but that's totally fine. It'd be good to get a different perspective on this. So this is Hazelwood Power Station. Hazelwood Power Station's out in the east of Victoria in a regional area, right? In the coal fields that happen to be out there. Now, Australia doesn't have very good quality coal. It's not brown coal. It's not black coal. It's brown coal. Lots and lots of moisture content, which means even more carbon emissions. On the flip side, we have a lot of it, and I do mean a lot. And therefore, it's a very cheap energy source, which up until climate change occurred, well, we became aware of climate change, was a wonderful thing for the state, as you can imagine. Hazelwood, however, was one of the worst power stations in Australia. By far, one of the most polluting, the most carbon emissions per kilowatt for any power station in the country. And so it became the focal point for a lot of campaigning. We got here, we're going after ANZ, which is one of the financial backers for the lending credit out to the company. We've got replace Hazelwood. Incidentally, the masks in this picture are well pre-COVID. This is all taking place in around the late 2000s to the early 2010s. We've got some government protesting of government institutions here. There's a government office in the background. You can see those green triangles, a symbol of the Greens, which is our environmental party over here. We also had some more directive action. A group of 14 people actually climbed the fence on one occasion, chained themselves down to the conveyor belts for the coal going into the things, which was remarkably effective in the short term. Actually shut the power plant down for about 10 hours. That said, you can imagine how this played out in the longer term, considering that occurred in 2009. It was close enough to September 11 and peak terrorist panic over here that got labeled terrorism pretty fast. I think they sidestepped those charges in the end, but pretty easy to spin that in the media, as you can imagine.
I imagine.
Yeah. And then this is on the other end of the spectrum. You've got that direct action, direct intervention thing, very tactical, but not very strategic, versus this. Now, this was an incredibly strategic campaign, which Environment Victoria, so there's three little sort of arrow shapes up there. That's another mainstream environmental advocacy group up here, but a little bit more aggressive and lobbyist than the ACL I mentioned earlier on, which tends to be a bit more behind the scenes partnership sort of work. Please don't get the impression that I'm maligning any of these actions. Incidentally, I see that it's all on the same spectrum of advocacy doing different things. But this was a postcard campaign. They essentially got anyone who cared about the environment, and in Victoria, well, in Melbourne at least, there's a lot of them, to fill out a postcard, which they sent at their expense over to the French energy minister. Now, why do that? Because the company that owned Hazelwood was a French energy company. So what they've done here is very clever. They've bypassed all existing points of resistance. They didn't go after the government here because they've got a vested interest. They didn't go after the company here, again, vested interest, or even the community. They went to the French energy minister, who wouldn't have the faintest idea that this company existed, right? Or that this power station existed. So all she knows is she got snowed under with about 10,000 postcards with a very interesting photo on the front there. You can probably see. I'll get to that in a sec.
Great picture. Great.
Yeah, right. A fantastic campaign. Very well run. But building further on that, and this is again Environment Victoria really took the lead with this. One of the major points of debate around this Hazelwood program was jobs. Right, often is very economy, right? As usual, it's usually the flip side or the foil to an environmental argument. In particular, the argument here that was done in the press, and the government took this up, was that we can't get rid of the power plant because it will ruin jobs. of course, they phrased that slightly differently. Greenies want to destroy jobs, blah, blah, blah. Now, the interesting thing about this was that Environment Victoria rose to the challenge and proposed, as so many organisations have at this point, a transition plan for climate change, saying that, okay, sure, we can't just hard and fast and ruin the economy, but the sooner we transition, the better, because it will allow for a softer landing, as opposed to having to wait until climate change gets to the point where it's overwhelming, at which point emergency action needs to be taken, at which point there will be no transition, right? So they actually pulled together, they employed some economists and pulled together a very thorough plan for this transition. Now you remember that photo on that postcard I mentioned earlier on. All of this sort of went up a notch in 2014 when the coal plant caught fire, or more accurately, the coal pit that it gets its coal from, which is right next door, caught fire. This is always a risk with something like this, an open cut coal mine. Unfortunately, the company that owned it at the time, thanks to a Conservative government over here at the time, had removed all of the fire suppression systems as a cost-saving measure, which meant that this burnt for approximately 14 days and gave us some pretty stunning visuals. Actually, 30 days, if memory serves, before they finally got it out, but it was pretty severe. This is showing the cloud plume downwind, which, I mean, quite apart from the carbon emissions, I actually had the misfortune of being in Gippsland at the time in this sort of area. And the particulate matter coming off of this was worse than any bushfire I've been around, to be perfectly honest. We got quite a few of those, but coal is something else. It was, I would not be surprised in the slightest to see a cancer cluster in these areas in the future.
Yeah.
Terrible stuff.
Question.
Please.
Did the more conservative voices try and pin the fire on the greenies, etc., at all?
Not to memory. They have done that since. We've seen quite the progression. We're always about 10 years behind you over in the US, but we're quickly starting to see conservative elements over here adopt more Trumpian tactics. For example, we may have heard we had our worst bushfire season ever last year, the start of 2020, and it burnt a colossal area. And yeah, they tried to pin those on environmentalists for trying to advocate for less backburning of areas, which one isn't true, and two, we've never actually held power of any kind, and so we didn't stop them from claiming it though. Very Trump-esque. But at this time, no, it was such an embarrassment for the state government at the time. They were really on the back foot. Went a long way to get them elected out at the next election, which was a huge relief, as you can imagine, for us environmentalists, but nonetheless. Now, the fun thing about this, and the reason I use this as the case study, is that eventually this power plant got closed. It got closed in 2016, right? Now, that should be seen as a win for us. And there is no doubt whatsoever that all of the campaigning added some weight to this. But this is the news article, and you can see in that last paragraph right down the bottom there, the company that ran this, the French company, Engie, stated that the reason they were closing the station was that it was no longer economically viable. Now, I hate to be a downer about this, but we lost, because they didn't close the power station because of any environmental considerations. They closed it because it wasn't making money. And the particular irony of this was that they didn't do it with a transition plan. After all that debate around, we want to preserve the jobs, we want to make sure that people are protected through all of this, and subsequently the environmental field pulling a lot of resources into building a transition plan to minimize that, they didn't transition them at all. They just sacked them. Gone. Retrenched about 250 of them into other, 140 of them into other businesses, and just sacked the rest. No transition plan whatsoever. State government was surprisingly quiet around this period, as you can imagine. So the question really arises from here is that everything was on our side. Everything. 79% of Australians currently agree that climate change is a serious issue and action is needed. We still haven't done anything about it. Similarly, the factual basis, the overwhelming scientific consensus, I mean, even something as relatively conservative as the IPCC is now posting stuff along the lines that we are all going to die. Like, we are looking at ecocidal full-blown collapse. I mean, we had a report come out today that 19 ecosystems in Australia, and I mean like not just areas, I mean like total ecosystems are on imminent collapse in the next 20 years. Everything is on our side here. I'm sorry, did you have a question? I noticed you couldn't handle it.
Oh, no, I was just scratching my chin.
Oh yeah,
Thanks.
cool. Please don't hesitate to jump in, especially just the two of us. And then there's this, right? So even the economics of this situation are overwhelmingly clear now. Solar power is the cheapest electricity source in history, not just currently, in history. And yet we continue to avoid it. So what's going on? Why do we keep losing? We shouldn't lose. If being right was sufficient, if having evidence on our side was sufficient, or even just doing a simple cost-benefit analysis of the medium to long-term impacts was enough, we would be winning overwhelmingly. We would never be having these debates. We would have won back round about when Al Gore made the topic popular and publicly known. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Frankly, we should have had it over in about 1970s. So what do we lose? Ethics and methods of ensuring that our decisions are accurate and justifiable. There's a whole bunch of methodologies of doing this, but I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on that today because, to be honest with you, the environment field doesn't struggle with this. The environment field does this very, very well. Power, on the other hand, is the means to control one's circumstances, which is the definition we're going to be using from today. And we don't do this well at all, I hate to say. And I'm not blaming us, to be perfectly honest. I didn't even know how this stuff worked until about 18 months ago, but we do need to get better at it. So a few various topics we'll cover off on today: nature of power, forms of it, where it comes from, how it moves and under what conditions, and the dangers of holding power. And most importantly, how this can all be operationalized to more successful campaigning. So we've sort of discussed this already, Terry, and considering we're recording this session, I won't go into too much more detail about this, but please do feel free to share your context as we go, coming from that communal housing. Sorry, remind me again the phrasing. I don't want to get it wrong.
Sorry, I missed that.
That's all right. What was the phrasing for the arrangement you've got over there? Communal housing or housing cooperative?
Co-housing.
Co-housing. Right. I'll remember that. Which is a fantastic example of a highly ethical setup, right? Like it's specifically designed to maximize the benefits for everyone involved, minimize the costs to the participants as well as society and the environment in general, right? Highly ethical concept. Power dynamics, on the other hand, and I'm sure you'll have plenty to say about this, can be a lot more complicated if they're not particularly well handled, which I'm not sure what your situation is like, but I've seen examples in Australia where that goes sideways. So, power, as I said earlier on, an operational definition, is simply your ability to control your circumstances. Now, this is very simple, and you'll notice that I'm not actually saying what circumstances we're talking about, because that's not really relevant. That's a question of ethics. But from power is your ability to bring about whatever set of circumstances you wish, and that can change. It can be completely nonsensical, but having power allows you to do that. And what you'll probably notice from this is that that is best achieved by controlling the circumstances of others. Now, a lot of what I do is in a professional context, and you can imagine how easy that is to demonstrate. Everyone, again, I'm sure this is the same in the US, but over in Australia, we have this strong individualistic sort of culture, which emphasizes individual responsibility. So you as an individual are responsible for your circumstances, and if you put the effort in, you will succeed. If you don't, you won't, etc. But that, of course, really does ignore the fact of how many institutions, individuals, other parties that you're subject to at any given time. So, I mean, if you're working in a business, even if you work on your own, you're subject to the needs and interests of your clients, right? If they don't buy the product, you don't sell. Regulators, broader economic factors. I mean, if the economy has a downturn, your business is going to suffer with absolutely no input from you, right? I mean, it makes no difference what you do. So if you notice then when we expand this out, your ability to control your circumstances is largely dependent on your ability to control the circumstances of others. So in a professional environment, if you can exert control over your clients, you can better exert control over yourself. You could describe that as marketing, but you could also describe that in slightly more subtle or overt ways as well. And that brings us in terms of where the power comes from. So, broadly speaking, there's 7 categories. And don't get too freaked out by this diagram. I'll go into a lot more detail about it. But we could divide these into subcategories. We could add them into larger categories. But I find this is the most useful way of dividing this up. And what they speak to is where we source that control from over our circumstances. And the obvious first one here is force. And most people, when I say this, imagine something along the lines of, warriors or thugs in the street or warrior culture and stuff like that. And sure, yeah, physical violence is a form of force and it is used as a form of control. In reality, though, for the vast majority of our interactions, it usually looks a bit more like this. Now, I think you said you came from Portland, Terry?
Yes.
Right, well, yeah, you've been front and center to some pretty obvious examples of this, I assume. Are you anywhere near the autonomous zone or the former autonomous zone?
We're halfway between downtown and the suburbs, so
Okay.
we're far enough away that we don't notice it unless we pay attention to the news or travel in that direction.
Right. Yeah. Well, 2020 was not a good year for this. Well, it was a very visible example of this.
Yeah.
The monopolization of force into the police is overall a very, very good thing. It's a hallmark of any given society. You can't have the average person having violence as a go-to recourse option. Vigilantism, we know, tends to end very badly. Monopolization into a state-based organization makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, it does tend to, there's a certain conflict of interest there when it comes to accountability. But if you go beyond this, you'll actually notice there's other acknowledgements of force as a source of power in society everywhere. Locks on doors. Simple fact, stealing is an extremely obvious use of force to control one's circumstances at someone else's expense. Come in, you take their stuff and you leave. You start to notice that in many ways, one of the great successes of society is taking force off the table as an option for controlling your circumstances. It does still happen, of course, but it is, compared to less stable places, incredibly rare. But it is still definitely acknowledged everywhere you go if you pay a little bit of attention to it. In the campaigning context, it's rare, but it's always possible. And it's usually outsourced to the police. Internal security guards, cameras, key passes, all this sort of thing all come up here as well. Protesting is indeed a form of force. I mean, essentially, you're occupying a street and being like, well, move us. What are you going to do about it? We can also get this in certain cultures as well, you know, that hyper masculine or alpha work culture where it's, you know, dominate through the fear of or imminent risk of force, even if it's not actually going to eventuate the threat thereof. A lot of bullying loses a lot of its edge when that threat of force is removed entirely. Staking it up a step in terms of forms of sophistication, we're talking about rules here. Now, rules is a form of power. Rules are actually a very fundamental source of ethics, one of the two major schools of thought when it comes to sources of ethics. But when it comes to ethics, we're talking about following the rules. When it comes to power, we're talking about who writes them, who interprets them, who implements them, who has review, who can appeal, who can't. What oversight do they operate inside of? Parliament being a very good example here on the left for Australia, but obviously Congress over in your country, Terry, and the various levels of government. Who writes the rules and who gets to interpret them? Introduces, and you know, do the rules apply to some and not to others? In practice, if not in theory, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Campaigning, policy, law, internal cultures and norms as well. And so it's worth noting that rules don't have to be explicitly written down. They're not necessarily just laws, right? Internal cultures and norms are massive at this. I mean, you can imagine actually thinking about it, the co-housing arrangement you've got there would no doubt have numerous unspoken rules, right? Things that people aren't compelled to follow necessarily, but things that will have consequences if you breach them. Friendship groups, obviously, this sort of thing tends to be the same. So who writes them, who edits them, who interprets them as the final say. Note that this can also occur within a campaigning context. We have this tendency, and this is going to be a common thread throughout this presentation, in progressive environments to try to minimize power differentials, to try and believe or pretend that there is no concentration of power, no hierarchy, or that rules are sort of eliminated out to some degree, but they're always there because someone writes them and someone interprets them and someone enforces them. And under what oversight, you know, who watches the watchmen and so forth. And that next source of power, taking it up another step of sophistication, is a hierarchy with your old feudalism model, but in a professional environment, very straightforward. Now, the interesting thing about hierarchies that I've come to notice over a period of time is they tend to form naturally, if you follow me, which is not to say that that makes them good, but it is very much, you can see the benefits. It's a very efficient model. More strategic decision-making happening up the top is easy to do when there's less people involved. I mean, you've sat on committees, no doubt, Terry, you know what that can be like. Efficient doesn't necessarily mean better, but it does mean more efficient. So, providing direction, strategy, looking for expansion opportunities, dealing with big external threats and providing cash versus coming from the other direction, the actual work, labor, information specialist, expertise, the time and the energy, etc. Now, this does, of course, beg the question of why do these people get so much higher rewards for being at the top? Theoretically, because they inherit a higher risk that, come on, we've seen that doesn't necessarily happen. So why don't they? Why don't the people down the bottom take over the people at the top? Well, one, this structure does tend to be more efficient. Two, though, the rules generally protect the people upstairs because they also tend to be the ones that write those rules. But three, there's also these people tend to bring the cash to the table or the raw resources. So in a campaigning context, it's the default format for virtually all communities, whether we recognize it or not. Formally, of course, you've got your organizational charts or your formal hierarchies inside an organization. But also informally, once again, put simply put, you put 10 people in a room, the person with the most charisma is going to tend to float to the top just by default, not by plan or design or even will. It just tends to happen. Please.
The person with the with the most what?
Charisma.
Charisma. Oh yeah.
So working with my students at the university, you can predict it every time. By the time you get to week 3 or 4, you put them into small groups. You know who's going to take leadership in that group. They don't even necessarily want the speaking position. They're just given it by default because they're the ones that are most comfortable with talking. And informal hierarchy forms. All right. Authority is clearly delineated in a structure like this. Sorry, please.
I just wanted to mention that the governance of our co-housing community, which we call an eco-village, but the governance is we're using sociocracy or holacracy. You're familiar with that, maybe?
Yeah, not thoroughly, but it sounds very interesting. Can you expand on that?
I still have trouble getting my head around it. There's interlinked circles, and it's interesting. But I think you're suggesting this is true, that you can set up structures to try and maintain the efficiency while avoiding the harms of hierarchy, but the internal dynamics still bring out those hierarchical effects, in my opinion.
In particular, Terry, where that does tend to come up is that the hierarchy, there's a tendency to view that as the only source of power. So we've gone through the most fundamental ones so far, rules and hierarchy, right? Very, very visible. The further we go up this tree, the less visible they become, or the more messy they become. So yeah, definitely, it'd be interesting to hear your reflections about how those interact. So, I mean, a hierarchy is much more sophisticated than a set of rules, because it doesn't matter what situation you encounter, a hierarchy can sort of deal with it, right? So if you have an unprecedented crisis or something that you're just not familiar with or don't know how to deal with, with a rule set, there's going to be loopholes. There's going to be situations where they just don't cover the situation, or they don't cover it well, or they can lead to bad outcomes if you follow them properly. Hierarchy, on the other hand, if it's a bigger problem than you're paid for, send it up. If it's a smaller problem than you're paid for, send it down. It can handle it. It's not necessarily going to work well, of course. Seniority doesn't necessarily come with competency. And this also varies. Not meaning that in any way in terms of age, Terry. I mean more in terms of like seniority in a hierarchy. But yeah, I take your point.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah. And that varies wildly based on culture as well. So what I haven't worked in the USA, but the people that I know that have and made the transition between Australia and the USA have noted that the US has a much more vertical hierarchic culture than Australia, where, for example, one of my friends, she moved from the US working in a bank over there to coming to Australia to work in a bank here, and she struggled immensely because she was used to the dynamic where she would tell her employees what to do, and they would do it because they were told to do it. Whereas over here, she got a lot of attitude along the lines of like, nah, I'll get to it later, or I don't really see the point of it. Why are we doing this? And that is, to a degree, emblematic of the company, but largely a result of Australian culture. We have a very, have you ever heard of tall poppy syndrome, Terry?
I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
a odd Australian invention. The tall poppy gets cut down. We have I don't know if this is necessarily still true. I think it's changing over time, but we have an inherent distrust of anyone who's more powerful or more special than others, which is pros and cons to that, as you can imagine. But it's an interesting adjustment.
Yeah.
Finance is the fourth source of power, and this is pretty straightforward. I mean, it's cash, right? Or any nominally agreed upon metric for value, right? Trade, barter, whatever. Favors can go in here as well. Alternative currencies. I know, again, I've been in a few communal environments where they've done away with cash. Didn't really do away with commerce, though, could they? So it sort of just shifted from one source of currency to another. Primary measure of success in a business environment, and it's tightly controlled and monitored for, and therefore it does present a very tangible weakness in a business structure. So you can see from that Hazelwood example, they went after the banks. With a couple of other organizations over here, they actually it was the Adani mine, largest coal mine in the world, being proposed right in the big middle of climate change. Brilliant move. And that was very successfully put off. I don't know if it's been completely stopped, but it was put off for a very long time because the company found it nearly impossible to find finance for it, because every bank in this country got lobbied to the point where they were like, nah, not for us. It is inherently worthless. Cash is just a metric, but it can only be used effectively if it can be spent, or if we can find things to spend it on, or if it's for sale. And then subsequently, it only captures the value that the market demands. It ignores everything else regardless of the evidence, which carbon pricing is a perfect example of this. Carbon's worthless according to the market. There's no price attached to it. And so there's absolutely no downside to putting it into the environment. Attach a carbon price to something like this, and suddenly the economy starts to account for it, and the economy can be used effectively as a harness here. But before that, not so much. Another good example of that is actually insurance. Insurance is quickly emerging as an unexpected sort of ally when it comes to climate change stuff, because they're quickly starting to realize, oh, about 30% of our properties are going to be underwater in about 60 years if this continues the way it is. Not good for us. And unfortunately, can very easily represent a fantasy rather than a reality. I mean, look no further than the stock market. I don't know if you've been following the GameStop share debacle thing.
Just reading the headlines. Yeah.
I mean, even just reading the headlines is ridiculous, right? Like, they inflated the stock just by buying it and then not selling it. It's
yeah.
Fifth form of information goes even more sophisticated, and we're looking at information here. This is essential for good quality ethics. Any form of ethics that we employ, absolutely any form of ethics we employ, requires good quality, accurate information to make good quality decisions. Whether we use a rules-based approach or a cost-benefit approach or a virtue ethics approach, any of them, they all require good quality information in order to accurately assess our situation. It can be formal information, controlled and recorded, or informal, shared or intuitive data. Now, there is a lot of informal data out there, and very, very valuable. Skill sets, qualifications, networks, awareness of your own limitations all qualify here. And what the opposition is doing is also very valuable here. And I can't speak for anyone else, Terry. We were nearly as badly affected over here by the election of Trump as I imagine the US was, because we are so incredibly dependent on your country, like for both trade, but also for culture. And so we've been following that so hard. That surprised everyone. I don't think I knew a single person who wasn't just being cynical who predicted that outcome. And to a large degree, that illustrates we were missing an enormous source of information. We hadn't thought to talk to the people that were supporting this movement. You know, this has actually popped up as a grassroots movement over here. We've seen people in the street with pro-Trump paraphernalia in Australia. But my inability to understand that is part of the problem, because you can't effectively counter a movement unless you understand that it's there and why. Which is not to say in any way that you agree with them, it's or that you should agree with them, or that you should empathize with them even necessarily, but it's rather a means of exerting control. I can't do it if I don't know what I'm dealing with. Gossip is a huge source of information, and one a lot of people tend to overlook because it is unethical or immoral, right? Immoral. But it is a very good source of power, which is why it exists. Culture, relationships, politics, they're all parts of this source of power. which brings us to the next one, which is technology. Now, this could be anything from a hammer through to a supercomputer, but essentially it's our ability to better, more efficiently use energy available to us. And in large part, this comes down to use of information. There's just such a huge volume of information available these days. And this is where organizations such as Facebook really thrive. There is no possible way Facebook could have used the information available to it for anything, really, without the technology necessary to process it. It's just beyond a human's ability to do so. Nearly all emerging markets are based on technological innovation at this point, which means that being aware of those technological innovations and or having any skills relevant to them will allow you to surf that wave as opposed to being sort of subject to it. And it's neither good nor bad by default. It depends entirely on how it's deployed, governed, and the consequences of its use. Unfortunately, the emergent nature of a lot of this tech, unprecedented in its nature, Facebook, perfect example, means that we don't know how to govern it because we don't know what it does. Facebook, for example, we still don't know what it does. There's no sufficient data at this point. We've only got about 10 years of it, about 15 years of data, but the platform keeps changing over that period of time, that it makes it very difficult to get representative data of what it does to a human being on a psychological level, let alone communities, let alone political discourse. We can make insights, but we have nothing reliable. Doesn't stop the company from operating, though, does it? And finally, and by far my favorite one here, psychological power. This perfect example. I'm not actually wearing a tie today, but why am I wearing a collared shirt, do you reckon?
Say again?
Why am I wearing a collared shirt?
I think you have to, given that you're doing this presentation, you have to convey a certain degree of respectability and mainstreamness, or people will discount what you're doing.
All very on point. Couldn't have put it better myself, Terry, and you're completely correct. Like, I know from experience that the way I dress, especially doing consulting work, as you can imagine, very much alters the way people perceive me and my authority, and subsequently alters whether or not they pay attention, much less whether or not they come on board. In fact, you can actually subvert that as well, for that matter. Sometimes I've played with the idea of showing up dressed more casually and then using that as a means of surprising people with depth of knowledge. Or you can go the complete other way, which is the classic marketing move, and overdress as a means of intimidation, right? But what you'll note is that, and I'm using a tie as an example here, what does a tie do? Because a tie does all of the things you just described. It's a sign of formality, it's a sign of respect, a sign of authority, a sign of reliability and competence, right? But it doesn't do anything. It's a symbol of all of those things, but it doesn't do anything. In fact, the only thing it actually does is serve as a noose. It sits around your neck. It's a slip knot around your neck. There's actually been some studies recently in medical journals that indicate that wearing a tie can actually cut off blood supply to the brain to a small degree, which is obviously not good. Female equivalent of this being high heels, terrible for the body, apart from some benefits to the pelvic floor, but nonetheless, they do convey a certain degree of authority or status, right? The point I'm making here, and you'll note that I am still wearing the collared shirt, and I do still wear ties, is that these benefits are purely psychological, purely. They do not exist anywhere except outside of our minds. This is profound and overwhelming. Literally every interaction you have with another person is an illustration of psychological power, whether you notice it happening or not. Literally every interaction you don't have with another person, seeing them and not talking to them, choosing not to have a conversation with them, seeing them across the room, will influence them to some degree, and vice versa, for better or worse. Hearts and minds is what we're talking about here. Public approval is part of this, individual approval. Norms, what is normal in a community, is just ridiculously overwhelming. We've just had an arrival. Excuse me while I just admit them and bring them up to speed a little. I had a phone call 30 seconds ago, so I imagine that might be related. Hello there. FE, can you hear me all right? You've got access to the chat box. You also have access to the microphone, I hope, but feel free to jump in at any point and ask some questions. If you're having any IT issues, please do let me know about that as well. I've got the chat box open perpetually here. But we're just going through the various sources of power. I'm about to sum that up so that hopefully we'll give you a bit of an idea here. But what we're talking about is power as your means to control your circumstances compared to whether or not those circumstances are a good thing or not, which is your realm of ethics. Yeah, no dramas whatsoever. Sorry. Hopefully I'm sorry if the meeting invitation came through a bit late. So to continue, Terry, just for your awareness, Effie, we are recording this session. If you'd like me to opt out of that, that's fine. But yeah, just for your awareness. So psychological power can include what's normal for a community, which is something that's often fairly difficult to express, but at the same time does have an overwhelming influence, right? In terms of what that community will accept, not accept, what they'll find offensive, problematic. Body language is a big part of this. Choice of phrasing, respect as well. All intangible factors at play are all ultimately psychological factors. They don't actually exist outside of the human mind, but they do have a profound influence over that state of mind. So at this, and bullying, once again, we sort of loop back to that first source of power with force. Bullying can often occur without any force being present whatsoever. In fact, I know several people, and one person in particular who is, shall we say, intimidating on a physical level. He's enormous, right? That man is bullied so goddamn frequently, purely because he doesn't have that psychological edge, and other people have figured that out, right? People take advantage of that. And despite the fact that he could easily wipe the floor with them, he doesn't think that he can. It doesn't enter into his head as an option. Not to say it should, but you get the point.
Yeah.
Interesting side question. And actually, Terry, coming from the US, this one would be an interesting one for you as well, because I imagine there's a slightly different thing here. If you met the Queen of the UK, would you bow?
I'm thinking of all kinds of things I want to say about that. But would I bow? Geez.
I know, right?
I would probably learn that I was supposed to, probably, I guess. But would I? I actually, well, it depends upon my larger goals and reputation and all of that, you know.
It's a complicated question, isn't it? I mean, it sounds so simple, but in practice, it's actually like, well, I mean, in what circumstances would you be meeting the Queen, right? It's going to be public. It's got to be public. And yeah, so a whole bunch of things start to come into play. But you think about why. Because let's be perfectly honest, and you're a stronger man than me if you wouldn't. And FEI, I'm hoping this is sort of resonating with you as well. I almost definitely would. Now, I loathe the concept of monarchy, as you can probably imagine. I like on paper, I don't know Queen Lizzie. I don't know what she's like. I don't know anything about her. I don't know why the UK continues it on or what the economic arrangements are, whatever. But the concept of monarchy, that she is superior to me by right of birth, much less by divine providence, offends me on a very deep level. I'd still bow. Why? Because she's already powerful. And this is where we start to see a really weird quirk of human psychology pop up. And this is something that has been actually demonstrated in some other research that I've since stumbled across, but something I noticed in my work myself. There is this weird facet in human thinking where we tend to give powerful people more power from our psychology. We tend to give them the benefit of the doubt more so because they're powerful. Right? So you think about Elon Musk, for example, or even Donald Trump for that matter. Anyone with a high degree of concentration of power, we tend to give them a free pass. I mean, sure, they'll get their critics, no question whatsoever, but they'll also get a lot of people coming to their defense. People they've never met, people that don't know them, people that will never be known by the powerful person. But they still come to their defense, really rabidly in some occasions too. And it's like, why? That psychological element's going to crop up further in, but it is rather disturbing. So, various forms of power. Which one of the 7 forms of power is real then? If we want to increase our control over our circumstances, regardless of what ends we want to bring about, which one of these should we focus on getting? The reality is that they are all real. They're all competing with each other all the time. This is a highly dynamic sort of environment. So, yeah, within your co-housing environment, for example, all 7 of these forms of power are present, if not necessarily emphasized at any given time. but they interrelate in an interesting way. So you remember I had this little pyramid up before, my inverse power pyramid. I enjoy myself some alliteration. The relationship here is between effectiveness and reliability. So force is down the bottom of this pyramid because it is incredibly reliable. It is more or less the foundational form of power. It cannot ever be denied. When I say it's reliable, what I mean to illustrate is that if you go into a bank with a gun, they're going to do what you say. But it's not very effective, right? Now, what I mean by effectiveness is that remembering that our definition of power is a means to bring about a set of circumstances, it's just a means. It doesn't have any power in and of itself. You can be Titanic. You can be the strongest human being that ever lived. And if there's no one around you, it doesn't mean a damn thing, does it? Right? So is it effective in bringing about the circumstances that you wish? And broadly put, force is very ineffective. So again, that bank robbery situation, yeah, you go in with a gun, everyone will do what you say. But why are you robbing the bank? To get money, right? Different form of power. Why? Well, to spend it on things, presumably with the ultimate goal of improving your quality of life or accomplishing some sort of outcome, right? Okay, so is the use of force in this situation to achieve that set of circumstances going to work? No, I don't think we've had a successful bank robbery in Australia that lasted for more than about 2 days since the 1950s, if memory serves. And yeah, the police are now overwhelmingly effective at preventing this sort of thing, right? Because why? They show up with more guns. That said, the reliability of that force cannot be denied because the only counter to that was more force, an overwhelming display, in fact. On the other end of that spectrum, however, we have psychological power, which is unbelievably effective at getting the results that you want, because you consider it the difference between an unwilling, someone that you pushed into doing what you want via force, rules, hierarchy, whatever, versus a willing and enthusiastic follower, someone that wants to help you contribute towards your goals, right? You've changed their mind. You've overwhelmingly changed their mind if you do it well, but it is remarkably unreliable. I mean, to be perfectly honest, having done a lot of this online training sort of thing, it's incredibly easy to lose people's attention. So easy. You know, and you'll forgive the crudeness of it, but to be honest with you, the worst thing that could possibly happen in a training session is that someone in the back farts. It's gone. That's it. Attention is gone. It's going to be about 10 minutes before I can reestablish or like even verbal control of the room, much less get them back to where they were emotionally and mentally, which is exerting that psychological control, right? So you range between the two, which leads us with finance sort of sitting more or less smack in the middle there. It is generally very reliable, but there are definitely exceptions to that. If someone doesn't want to sell something, well, there goes your financial power, doesn't it? Meanwhile, your effectiveness, it is generally very effective at getting what you want. On the other hand, not if it's not for sale, or not if it can't be bought, or if it doesn't, exist in that space. So returning to those personal examples. So again, Terry and Effie, please feel free to jump in here if you'd like via the chat or just via voice. Thinking about your personal situation, and again, there's a reason why you came into this session. Are any of these sources of power resonating with you in particular? Have you used any of these effectively? Have any of them been used effectively against you, or anything that's caught you by surprise?
I've been caught by surprise by some of the dynamics in our meetings, in our co-housing community. The things that people do to maintain the attention on themselves, for example. And
Sure.
I heard somebody describing this as, how did they say it? It's about if you keep repeating something, even if you're wrong, even if people don't like what you're saying, at some point they give in. People are like, all right, enough. We'll do it your way. That comes to mind.
Yeah, no, absolutely. An excellent example. And that's going to be particularly pertinent when we get to the power dynamics bit with the movement of that power, because that is a perfect example of something that's a big problem here. All right, so let's move on to that now. So the power dynamic. We've identified where power comes from, but that's minor, to be honest with you, compared to the movement of power, because it's just simply identifying where the power comes from. What we really want to be doing is accumulating more of it, right? Two broad schools of thought on this, both of which have some problems. The first is that power is competitive. Simply put, if you want more control over the situation, you need to take it away from someone else. It's a zero-sum game, so to speak. So there can only be one winner. Now, this is pretty emblematic in budget, sort of like budgeting inside an organization. For example, there's X amount of dollars. You can't split, you can't share money. So, right, the more effective you are at exerting yourself in a situation like this, the more cash you get. On the other hand, we also have the power as collaborative, which is your team environment, right? As well as corporations as an entity as a whole, highly competitive environments in many regards, but fundamentally collaborative exercises, right? This would say that we get more power by working together, whereas competition would say that you need to be fighting for it at all times to try and get as much power as you can personally control. Collaborative power would indicate that working together gets you more power than you can get individually, right? Now, the problem we're going to have here is, as you probably already noticed, is, well, twofold. First and foremost, they contradict each other. If power is competitive, then what are you doing working with other people? You should be stabbing them in the back. You should be walking over their corpses and, you know, climbing that corporate ladder, right? Any collaboration is just a weakness. On the other hand, if collaboration is the source of power, then competing with each other is just a waste of time and energy, right? Unfortunately, we've also seen both work, no doubt. I mean, corporations are collaborative exercises. Any sort of team, any sort of family is a collaborative exercise. We've seen that work. On the other hand, we've also seen plenty of people get rewards by, you know, at the expense of others, and they both also fail. So we have some problems here. We have an inherent paradox. The core part of my work and what the book is largely based around is resolving this paradox. And I propose two maxims here. I think that it is both collaborative and competitive, but they don't contradict each other because they're working on fundamentally different ways. The first is that power is not shared. Power cannot be shared. Within a given scenario, there is a finite amount of power over that situation. Meeting, for example, you're in a meeting with 10 people, right? There is X amount of control over that. If everyone needs to vote at the end of the day, then the total control in the room is 10 votes. Within a given scenario, therefore, the finite amount of power must be divided by the parties involved. Has to be, right? Even if it's split evenly between those 10 people, so be it. It's still divided. You can't share a vote. That said, power is also collaborative because the amount of power can be multiplied. So we're talking about volume of power as opposed to the division of that power. And when you collaborate with others, you expand the amount of control you have over the situation itself. Because bear in mind, once again, we're voting for something. We're trying to achieve an outcome. That is our expression of power. We're trying to achieve an outcome. Increasing the amount of power we have over that scenario increases our ability to do that. Collaborating increases that volume, whereas the competitive element divides it. Now, that's probably a little bit confusing in word salad in theory. So let me illustrate this in a very simple way. Team building day. Person A, person B, both need to get over this wall to get to the goal. Now, if they do this competitively, this is not happening. Partly because the wall is just simply too tall for any one of them to climb, but also for the fact that anytime one of them gets anywhere near the top, the other one's just going to pull them down, aren't they? It's not going to happen. You will fail. So we collaborate. Person B can lift up person A. Person A can get on top of the wall and pick up person B. Everyone wins, right? By collaborating, we've expanded our control over the situation itself and increased our ability to succeed. Where's the problem? This is like a litmus test for cynicism, I swear. That some people get this immediately and other people's not so much. How could this go wrong?
This meaning the collaborative example?
Yeah. So this scenario, we've decided that competition won't work. Collaboration does work. So why don't we always collaborate? What is a potential risk of this collaborative approach?
One or the other of the parties can stop collaborating at any point?
Yeah, precisely. Specifically person A. Because person A is the first one to go up.
Yeah.
Someone needs to lift the other party. You can't both go up at the same time. We tried it. It didn't work. And once person A is on top of the wall, they can do anything they like, and you can't stop them. Which means that while betrayal like this may not occur, certainly isn't guaranteed. I mean, and will in large part depend on person A's ethical compass and so forth, as well as the degree of the goal available. This is possible, and it's possible explicitly because they collaborated. This would never have happened if they competed. And this in turn begs the very worrying question, given this reality, who would ever agree to be person B? You'd always want to be person A, right? I mean, who's going to hesitate to be the person that's hoisted up? That's maximum power, maximum control, maximum success. But then again, who the hell is going to agree to be the person at the bottom, who subsequently becomes totally subject to person A and totally vulnerable to betrayal? And so there's this tendency to revert back to the competition angle of this, which we know doesn't work, but it's still better than being betrayed. This illustrates the problem. This is the key problem with all of this sort of thing. Collaboration is ideal for creating power. We want to collaborate. Collaboration is ideal. It helps us achieve our goals far more effectively and far faster as well. This is human society in a nutshell. We collaborate, we do better. It's our great strength. But it allows for betrayal. Inherently, it allows for betrayal. You cannot collaborate without becoming vulnerable to the group. And if that betrayal is rewarded, well, we just rewarded unethical conduct, didn't we? And that becomes the new norm. Power is always competitive as a result, and that needs to be recognized. Now, you may give that example before, Terry, about the person who's the extent to which some people are willing to go inside a meeting in order to maintain attention on themselves. I got a really good example of exactly that as well. There's an organization over here that you mentioned. I remember that you may remember I mentioned the Greens Party over here, which is our environmental, socially progressive political party over here. Generally holds about 10% of the vote. We have, what do you call it, ranked voting over here, so that's possible compared to the first past the post system in the US. And they have problems, bluntly put. They don't have problems with their policy. Policy is great. They have internal problems with their culture. And I did a little bit of work from a while back, and one of the big problems we identified there is that they do consensus decision making, meaning that for any decision to be made inside a meeting, everyone has to agree. Everyone, 100% agreement before the decision can be passed. Right now, that is so us. You know what I mean? That is so the environmental field in a friggin' nutshell. You can see what it's intending to do. And you can see what it's meant to eliminate power dynamics from the environment. It's meant to flatten the playing field entirely to make sure that absolutely everyone is given an equal stance, equal value. In reality, what do you reckon happens?
Well, I've seen what happens because that's what our co-housing community used for, I don't know, 2-3 years. And then they switched over to the sociocratic approach, which decisions are made based on, is it safe enough to try and good enough for now?
That's good. It's a nice sort of risk assessment sort of based approach. That's quite, I'd like to learn more about that actually too. It's very interesting. Good governance approach.
And there's an evaluation after X amount of time. It's baked in right from the beginning. So you reevaluate where you are at some point.
Yeah, fantastic.
You're not committed to it forever.
Yeah, also very sensible. The risk and what the Greens continuously run up against is the simple fact that a consensus approach doesn't eliminate the power dynamic. It just concentrates it into the last person to make the decision. You've effectively created a dictatorial environment, except it's actually worse because the person doesn't even need to take the lead. It's not like one person inside the room takes control and drives their agenda and therefore sort of inherits a degree of responsibility and risk. No, this person just needs to sit there and be as big an asshole as they can to get everything they want. And they don't even have to take responsibility for the outcome because they're the objective, right? It's the worst. It's way worse than even a dictatorial approach. So you can see why this becomes a problem. Here's the point, and this is going to be pretty fundamental to the rest of this. If you're not playing the game when it comes to power, you're losing the game. And the unfortunate reality here is that neutrality isn't possible. It's not possible. I wish it was. I really don't like this, but it's not possible. And just once more for those in the back, neutrality isn't possible. The implications for this, for how we conduct ourselves, particularly on the progressive end of things, where we do try, we really try to hold ourselves to a really high standard, are pretty devastating. Being the bigger person doesn't make you more successful. It just means that you lose. Going high when they go low, as Obama famously coined, well, that didn't really work out for him either, did it? It gets you beaten down on, it gets you abused. Walking away, being the bigger person, forgiving those who don't reform, they just mean that we lose because we're refusing to play the power game. And meanwhile, those who are unethical do not hesitate. They will stomp all over us every opportunity. And look no further than what's happening in the US political system right now, and Australia for that matter. It's become recognized as an effective tactic. Don't apologize. Don't compromise. Don't even worry whether you're telling the truth or not. Just go as hard as you can for as long as you can on the same point. Like, the sheer degree of blatant and outright hypocrisy that's taken place in the political discourse in the last few years has been unbelievable. But that's because we're not looking at it from a power perspective. We're looking at it from an ethics perspective. Simple reality is that from a power perspective, it worked. I mean, they lost the election, obviously, but you know, that's actually going to be quite relevant to the next bit. A good example of this, unfortunately, from the environment perspective, ExxonMobil knew about climate change back in the 70s. They were amongst some of the first that found out about the issue, and you're probably aware of this, Terry and Effie, with the research they did at the time. And they dealt with this information by funding lobby groups to pretend that the issue wasn't real. Why? Not because they're evil. Well, they're beyond, not just because they're evil, but because this maximized their window to sell the resource they were already heavily invested in. Very good economic policy. From a power perspective, this is genius. From an ethics perspective, not so great. Cost them nothing, nearly nothing compared to what they made. And to give a rather distressing local example, what we have here is the University of Notre Dame, Australia, which has partnered with the Lancet, both venerable institutions, as you're no doubt aware, the Lancet being the premier, the #1 medical journal. This is a partnership intended to, drawing on some truly exceptional people, intended to research the probable and real world health implications of various climate change scenarios as they advance, as well as potential future scenarios, allowing for better integrated planning, better adaptation. This is multidisciplined. It's extremely well led. Some of the people involved in this are extraordinary. It's in two major institutions which are fundamentally based in a scientific principle, which is to say they're highly, highly rigorous. Like, academics' reputations determine their career success and their trajectory. I mean, if anyone is found to be lying in any of these studies, they're toast, absolute toast. It's a cutthroat world in academia. Okay, so great, right? Really, really good bit of policy. This, on the other hand, is a think piece written by a right-wing pundit in one of our right-wing papers, entitled "Our Universities Have Caved into Lazy Groupthink." And fundamentally what it's around here was a bunch of climate strikes at the start of 2020, right after the worst fires we'd had in our history, and finishes with, "The global climate strikes show that universities are no longer the chief institutions through which knowledge is preserved, generated, and disseminated. Australian campuses are rapidly becoming places where intellectual inquiry is being crippled and free exchange of ideas is severely limited. Collectivism and groupthink have no place in our universities, which to all intents and purposes are failing at their purpose." This individual is the director of the Foundations of Western Civilizations program at the Institute of Public Affairs. The Institute of Public Affairs is the right-wing think tank that does policy development for our conservative governments and is strictly libertarian in its thinking, which is to say, wrong. I have very little truck with that political philosophy, but either way. The Foundations of Western Civilization program is not really just Western history. It is instead it's more or less white supremacism. It's a program they're trying to introduce into university curriculums to push the narrative that Western civilization was inherently superior. Basically, what we're looking at here is a giant piece of propaganda. There's not a single evidentiary claim in this entire thing beyond a couple of public opinion surveys they commissioned themselves. She makes no solid claims. She provides no evidence. Here's the really distressing question. Between this and this, which one is going to have the larger impact on public perception of the topic and therefore on the policy stance going forward? We know the answer to that, don't we?
We do, unfortunately.
Problem being, this is extraordinarily ethical. This is as high a standard as I could hope for anyone or anything to aspire to. From both a deontological approach and a utilitarian approach, this is exceptional. This is incredibly unethical, but it's really good at the power. Fantastic at it. And this brings us back to this. As long as this betrayal option over here is viable, much less rewarded, which it is at the moment, it will continue to be used, which makes that collaboration nearly impossible. What we're aiming for here is to take this off the table. That's our job, is to remove this as a viable option, or at the very least to reduce the amount of reward and viability that is available to do this. Now you'll notice that this is exactly what a legal system is meant to do. Yeah, our codes of ethics, our law system, our various cultural norms, they're meant to remove betrayal as an option. And to a large part, they've been successful. I mentioned right at the start of this that force has largely been removed as a viable option for getting what you want in society. It still happens from time to time, but the prevalence is virtually gone, especially considered to prior historical times, right? Now, that's not just on a rules basis or on a force basis. It's also on a psychological basis. To a large part in Australia, people don't, use force or rob shops because they don't think they can. They don't see it as a viable option, or they think that it's inherently immoral on a really deep level. The cultural norms also don't tolerate it. There's no reward for doing so. There's no tolerance of it. And therefore, people just don't. What we need to do is to extend that further. So, yeah, just to skip through this, sorry, I'm just conscious of relative lack of time. Though, if people would like a break, do either of you want just a couple of minutes? Or no, you're good? Okay, cool. So, as I said, what we want to be doing is removing this as an option. The problem is that power is not conditional on ethics. Now, that's probably pretty self-evident, but it's also a pretty horrifying evidentiary conclusion to come to. You do not need to have a high ethical standard to get power, nor do you need to be powerful to be ethical. There's no conditional link between the two. There is an influential link to some degree. The more sophisticated forms of power do have a tendency to encourage good ethics, though not always, and vice versa. The less sophisticated forms, such as rules and hierarchy, and particularly force, do tend to encourage slightly less ethical behavior. But there is no conditional link, which leads to this very interesting little segment here: perils of power. Again, my alliteration. Power is our means to control our circumstances, right? But power is always competitive, and therefore we would assume that the more power that you can personally accumulate or your organizational group can accumulate, the better. Surely there's no such thing as too much power. Not so much. Turns out that there's a few inherent problems with having a concentration of power. And from an environmentalist perspective in particular, this is incredibly important to both managing within our organizations and movements, but also dealing with opponent groups, because this can illustrate some vulnerabilities. So, classic example, you're in an organizational structure, standard organizational structure, right? We've got a bunch of managing directors, you've got CEO up the top, you've got HR off to the side there, and a bunch of employees underneath. All right. Let's say this person comes in. Sales rep. You're one of these sales reps down here in this department, and one day, one of your colleagues, another sales rep, comes into the organization, stubs their toe horribly on the way in, and is now in an incredibly foul mood, just a terrible mood, and starts to take it out on people around them. Verbal abuse, shitty behavior, poor performance, all just the usual thing, right? Very childish, but nonetheless understandable. This behavior needs to be corrected for everyone else's well-being, as well as for the interests of the person who's doing this as well, quite frankly, because they're sabotaging their own interests in the process. What options do we have with a colleague who's behaving like this to correct this behavior? Anything come to mind?
Well, one thing I've seen done is you isolate them. You, what's that called? Like shunning them.
Hmm. That's actually, I never had that one suggested before, but yeah, that'd be pretty powerful. Hmm. Which is also actually an interesting question, Terry, because coming from the co-housing environment, that would be something that needs to be dealt with, right? If someone inside the housing environment, because it's so closely interrelated, is having a really, really bad time for whatever reason or behaving very badly, that needs to be corrected. Otherwise, that internal culture is going to go to hell really fast. Now, there's a huge number of ways that can be dealt with, right?
Well, we've been trying things for 10 years with one individual, and we can't get rid of her. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah. So there are definitely those extremely firmly attached people. But nonetheless, actually a really good example of power versus the ethics, because some people are just really, really dedicated to playing the power game as opposed to, doing the right thing. But from this sales rep's perspective, I mean, you can talk to them, you can try and have a conversation with them. You're on the same level as them, so that's doable. Worst case scenario, you can talk to the team leader. You can talk to the vice president, even necessarily, or the managing director. You can go to HR. There'll be a bunch of corrective options there. No doubt they're violating all sorts of internal policies. I mean, if we want to get really down and dirty, you can always take them behind the dumpster and beat them up, right? The point being is that there's options. All right, consider this one. Exactly the same situation, but this time it's this person. Managing director comes into work that morning, stubs their toe on the door frame, now in an incredibly foul mood, starts to take it out on people around them. Small problem, of course. These people are under their direct supervision. What can be done to correct their behavior? Not much. You could plausibly talk to the CEO or one of the other managing directors or HR, but I mean, who does HR work for, right? Not to mention that the other managing directors, you don't report directly to them. What are you doing in their office? And they'll have a better relationship with the other managing director than you will. Meanwhile, the CEO, I mean, I don't know anyone who's actually, I do know one person who walked into the CEO's office one time. That was, wow, that was something else. That was, I'd hesitate to call it successful. It was certainly entertaining for someone that wasn't even remotely involved. But yeah, pretty damn dangerous thing to do for a low-level employee to go directly to the CEO and walk into their office to complain about a managing director. That's really committing. If it doesn't go well, it's going to go real bad. What we're illustrating here is exactly the same conduct, exactly the same childish, pathetic conduct impacting on other people's needs. The further up the tree this person is, the more of a concentration of power they have over their circumstances, the worse the situation gets, not just for those underneath them, but the harder it becomes to correct. And let's be very clear about this. While the managing director at the top here might be having a really good time just throwing their weight around in this one instance, if this becomes a pattern, or even if it just happens the one time, this is really bad for the managing director. Really bad. Because think about what's going to happen underneath them. There goes your trust. Who's ever going to rely on this person ever again? You will never approach this person with criticism. You will never trust them to react as a mature adult. You probably start looking for alternative workplaces. This is not good for the managing director, but they also can't have the behavior corrected, can they?
Hey, what?
They can't have the behavior corrected.
Oh, right. Yep.
Yeah. So to expand on that, 3 perils of power, that first one is exactly what we just illustrated. A concentration of power actually discourages accountability for its use, which is exactly the opposite of how it should work. The more control you have over other people, the more accountable you should be for it, because the more severe your impact if you screw it up, right? But in reality, unless it is specifically managed for, there is less accountability for what you do. And to be perfectly honest with you, in some ways, that sort of makes sense, because why else did you seek it in a concentration of power in the first place if other people can tell you off, right? The ability to protect yourself and your interests and not hear unpleasant things is kind of one of the motivations. But it's a serious problem, because it means that you won't notice when you're making mistakes. You are getting critical information cut off from you, because those staff are not going to come into your office and be like, boss, I think you're making a mistake. Because why would they do that? They've seen how you react. Subsequently, similarly but slightly differently, power corrupts reason. Now, we're not talking about access to information here, which is the first point. We're talking more about your ability to process it. Now, there are 188 known cognitive biases in human psychology, and those are only the ones that are documented. You cannot eliminate bias from human reasoning, but you can manage for it. The problem is that's extremely hard to do independently because they're your biases, right? How are you meant to notice your own biases, especially in a situation where you have a strong vested interest or where you're highly stressed? The best way to do that by far is to surround yourself with people who will call you out on it, correct? Or better yet, to develop structural factors that will prevent that from taking place. Academia is really good at that for the most part, in the sense with that peer-reviewed sort of process, which is deliberately intended to tear apart anything that's incorrect and rewards that, makes it hard for biases to get through. Corporate environments, on the other hand, much less informal societal structures, do not, which means that the more powerful a person becomes, the more errors they will make in the processing of information, and they won't even notice they're doing it. And finally, no one ever thinks they're the bad person, ever. In fact, to be perfectly honest, the only human beings I've ever met that self-described as bad people were just good people with really bad self-esteem. The people that I have met that were genuinely bad people, and I have met a few, like genuinely terrifying human beings, like make the hair on the back of your neck stand up sort of thing, like full-blown sociopathy or full-blown narcissism, like terrifying individuals to talk to when you really plumbed into how they made their decisions. They definitely don't think they're bad people. They think they're fantastic. Now think about the implications of that for a concentration of power. They will systematically eliminate anything that tells them otherwise. Now, this is very understandable, of course, because no one likes being told they're a bad person. But of course, a wise person recognizes that as an opportunity to improve. But you don't have to. Just to illustrate the cognitive biases, this is the Cognitive Bias Codex of 2016. I think a few more have been added since then. Don't attempt to read this, it's enormous. But what this has done is grouped all of these cognitive biases into various subcategories. And just to zoom in on one category here, like you can see some common themes start to emerge here, where we notice when something's changed, for example. Yeah. And like, again, confirmation bias is perhaps a very obvious one with here. We do tend to select information that confirms what we already believe compared to things that conflict with what we believe in, which it's a self-protection mechanism, right? We're drawn to details that confirm our existing beliefs. But what this codex does in particular, which is quite genius, is that it looks at why we do that. And if you look at these biases from an evolutionary perspective, evolutionary psychology being an emerging field on this, it helps us deal with a situation of too much information, right? Which is all situations. Stereotyping, for example, is a terrible bias. It's very, very inherently illogical. But if you think about it from a sort of an evolutionary perspective, you can start to understand why it's so deeply ingrained. If you're in the jungle and you see something orange, the sensible thing to do, the logical thing to do is to investigate it and figure out what the thing is specifically. But if the last 5 times that happened, 7 people died because it was a tiger, you can understand why over a period of time, we start to get that heuristic developing, that logical shortcut, just being like, let's err on the side of caution here. The problem is we've dragged all 188 of these biases into modern society and they don't work so great there. Okay. So back to these personal examples. You seen any of this sort of thing in play before? A key question here, have you seen a powerful group fail?
Yeah.
Or individual for that matter.
Yeah, I've seen I've seen a group have 500,000 people go through their trainings and yet not retain more than 10% of those people actively using that training.
Interesting. Huh. What do you think led to that? Do you think the quality of the training was lacking, or?
The authoritarian hierarchy turned people off. The people who were the most independent in their thinking said, who needs this? So it was a machinery for hanging on to the least capable people in terms of rational thinking.
Right, which is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, the true believers.
Mm. Which paradoxically are also the least equipped to be useful to that organization.
Yep. Yep.
I mean, cults are a really good example of this. Cults are, and I always joke with people, it would be so easy to start a cult. It's not hard. The concept is pretty straightforward. You just find the incredibly vulnerable and you offer them an opportunity to get out of it if they follow you and do what you say, right? There's obviously a far more abusive structures to that, but at the same time, yeah, it's sort of self-selecting away from the people that you're trying to accumulate, right? Now, that's funny also, because why do you think they employed that authoritarian approach in the first place? Because they thought that it would help them secure their membership, right? I mean, they certainly didn't have an interest in driving those members away. And so paradoxically, that strict father paternalistic model has self-sabotaged, right? Fascinating. We've actually got a couple of good examples from over here in Australia, and particularly in Victoria. As you may have heard, Terry, Australia, or Melbourne specifically, we had a nasty outbreak by Australian standards. I think we had 800 deaths, I think, all told, and bad for Australia, pretty good compared to everywhere else in the world, but definitely by far the worst in Australia. And we had, paradoxically, some of the strictest restrictions in the world during that period of time. Stage 4, you weren't allowed to move within 5 kilometers of your house. You weren't allowed to have anyone around your house. I think at most you could have a bubble arrangement with one other household, just for those who were living alone. Everything was taken away. Everything was closed. You really weren't allowed out of your house. At the worst of it, you were allowed to go outside for 1 hour of exercise a day. Now, this wasn't rigorously enforced, as you can imagine, because, police state. But at the same time, it was very, very stringent. It worked. We're down to 0 cases now, but at the same time, as you can imagine, not exactly popular. And what happened is that the opposition party, the Conservative Party in Victoria, we have call it a moderate party, vaguely left-wing party over here in power at the moment. The Conservative Party in opposition used this as 110%. We are using this as our point of leverage to get these guys voted out. This was how they were going to win. Every day they would come out with a new statement, with a new stance, hammering this lockdown. And week after week, you've got, this was comparable to the worst of what was happening in the US. This was unbelievable every day. Incidentally, I do apologize for us being responsible for Murdoch over there. One of our worst exports ever. Jesus. Anyway, but this is one of his papers, and one of his founding paper in many ways. The bastard. Either way, it was over the top. It was extreme. So I was looking at this, and we were all sitting there thinking, well, he's stuffed. I mean, even the left-wing paper, nominally left-wing paper over here, pretty moderate, really, turned around and more or less announced Dan Andrews as the premier at the moment with that centre-left party as being more or less kaput. He was stuffed. And that's what everyone thought. Everyone thought it. I don't know a single person in Victoria who was looking at the Dan Andrews situation going, well, yeah, he'll win the next election. Stuffed. The reality, his poll numbers went up. They went up. And most tellingly, the poll numbers for the opposition went so far down. They went down to single figures, which was fascinating. And this was one of the most persistent hit campaigns I've ever seen. It was overwhelming, ceaseless. There was no, and also, while a lot of this stuff does tend to focus around falsehoods or a lack of truth, with this in particular, no one really knew if the lockdown was working or not, because, I mean, how do you tell? Right? It's the sort of thing you can only evaluate. You can't really monitor whether it's actually working or not, because maybe a new outbreak's just around the corner. Is it excessive? Who knows? So we really did see, this completely failed. And in some ways, it is also sort of evocative of a similar failure that occurred 2 years prior in 2019, when this government won re-election. And the Conservative Party at the time attempted to use their reason of the moment to get this party voted out was that Melbourne's unsafe due to African gangs. We've had quite an influx of, nothing compared to any other developed country, because, you know, Australia is very small. We've got 25 million people here. It barely counts. But we had an influx of African migration, and the right wing decided that African gangs were now a thing. Of course, they didn't even exist. There was virtually nothing taking place here. This was nearly entirely a fabrication. But this failed as well, badly. They actually lost seats as a result of this campaign. But what both of these illustrate is that just because you've got everything on your side in terms of power doesn't mean that you're going to win, right? Now, that seems paradoxical, being given that power is your ability to control your circumstances. Certainly, these groups lacked power through other sources, but they also fell foul of those perils of power. They thought this was working. They thought this was going to work. It didn't. And they had no means of finding that out until after the fact, right? They'd more or less, they were operating in a bubble. They'd precluded people from around themselves who could have told them that this isn't actually working. And that in turn provides us with a bit of a template for some of the options we have for going forward when it comes to advancing environmental causes. So these 3 perils of power. All right, so what does this mean for us in terms of effective campaigning? And we've got a nice 30 minutes left on this, so this works out well. Hazelwood, once again, we looked at this and we looked at the various approaches that were employed. And you can see, having gone through the various power frameworks, how some of these do reflect good awareness of those power frameworks. You can see this one is going not after the company itself, not after the Hazelwood, but after the financiers of that project. Clever, right? Find strategic ways around it. Similarly, going after the government directly as opposed to going after the company. They're the decision makers after all. We saw a lot of grassroots stuff taking place here as well, which was good. And the direct action. Now, this, on the other hand, probably not that good of an idea, or not that effective from a power perspective. You're seeing force in action here, essentially. Very effective at shutting down the power plant. Unfortunately, played directly into the hands of the opposition, because they were able to spin this as terrorism, which tarnish the entire issue. Now, this is not to say that direct action like this doesn't have its place, but only if it works, and this did not, right? This sort of thing is very, very effective at making sure the issue stays in the headlines. But in this case, kind of backfired. This, on the other hand, highly effective because it bypassed all existing points of resistance. It went directly to someone who didn't have an oar in this, didn't give a rat's ass either way, it suddenly does, because they just got inundated with 10,000 postcards saying, hey, one of your companies set fire to our state. That's secures psychological power to a large degree over this individual who otherwise doesn't have any interest in this particular debate. Hopefully, well, it's unclear, of course, because you can never be sure about these things, how much of an influence this had on the ultimate decision, but this did occur just before the power plant was shut down. This use, once again, a very good appeal to psychological power, but also technology and information, and also finance. From Environment Victoria, recognizing that, yeah, actually there is an impact on these local communities if we shut down these power stations, and being able to step up and address that largely took this off the table. I mean, it's hard for the government, there's this degree of shamelessness in saying still running the same line even when it's been defeated, but we could respond effectively to those claims as opposed to just running our own rhetoric. Fires, of course, didn't help in the slightest. It didn't hurt in the slightest when it came to the campaigning. Definitely not worth the cost, obviously, but opportunity knocks. Now, this is a fun one because whenever there's a crisis like this, inevitably the opposition turns around and says, oh, you can't politicize a crisis. Why? All crises are inherently political. And what is going to become a strong theme in a second, and hopefully already is that we fall for that sometimes. We get suckered right into that. People say, oh, you can't politicize a crisis. And we go, oh, no, you're right. This should be about the victims. Why? I mean, the whole point of politicizing this crisis in particular was exactly about the victims. One, to get them better aid in the moment, but two, to prevent this from happening a second time. Not to mention the broader issue of climate change, which is definitely about the victims and everyone else as well. We fell for the argument that to be ethical, you can't be powerful. Whereas what we now know is that there's no conditional link between the two whatsoever. So What we're going to look at here is power, managing downwards, having power over others versus managing upwards when you're working with those that have more power than you. Now, obviously, from the environmental perspective, it sounds a little bizarre to be talking about having power over others, but it does happen. We are relatively powerless, but at the same time, it does happen and it needs to be recognized when it does. In particular, a power imbalance exists when we're trying to campaign with the general public, because believe it or not, we do have a substantial power concentration over them when it comes to campaigning. Specifically, you're asking them to do something and you're trying to influence how they behave and how they think. That's an effort to exert power over them. And the first step about managing that is recognizing that that power imbalance does actually exist and therefore does introduce those perils of power to us. Subsequently, we need to value that critical feedback, because that's perhaps the biggest problem with having a concentration of power is you tend to shut off sources of criticism. You can't improve without it. We can't refine our campaigning methods without it. We can't correct mistakes unless we know that it's not working. Now, valid criticism is valid criticism, obviously. We're not talking about in bad faith engagement from the opposition here. What we're talking about is feedback from the communities whose minds we're trying to change. Even when it hurts, which unfortunately a lot of the time it will. When we're fundamentally trying to do a good thing for everyone, then getting opposition and being told that we're idiots for doing so is very unpleasant, very harmful. And self-care is very important as a part of that. Good communities around you is very important as part of that. But it doesn't change the fact that we're trying to exert influence over other people or exert power over others. We must be aware of what they're thinking. We also can't change a position if we don't understand what their position is in detail. Personally, I've found that a lot of climate change denial in particular tends to revolve around fear, not actual policy or evidence or anything like that, just simply fear. And that's not surprising when you think about the fact that think about what you're introducing to them, saying, hey, here's this massive strategic issue, global in scale, that no individual can really do anything effective about, that really requires a strategic response from multiple international governments and several multinational institutions. But could you please stop eating some meat and stop enjoying a few things that you enjoy? And also, that's about it. Enjoy your existential crisis. Oh boy. I mean, when the alternative there is pretending it doesn't exist and therefore feeling great, you can understand, right? Even if you don't agree with it. Accommodating that as opposed to just getting pissed off with them and finding ways to better work with that group, very important. So subsequently, we have to earn trust here. Consistent, reliable respect and inclusion, and particularly when things go wrong, is incredibly important. One big divide over here, Terry, is with the mining companies, the mining employees in particular. Fossil fuel companies, mining companies tend to have some common interests. The funny thing is that miners over here, and not to mention blue collar workers in general, people that work for the power companies, people that work for companies that do emit a lot of carbon, tend to view environmentalists as as assholes, frankly, as hopelessly naive, city slickers, latte sipping, la-di-da-di-da. We've got this weird fixation on coffee in Australia, but whatever. The funny thing is they also don't trust their employers. They're extremely clear on the fact that their employers will throw them are bastards and they'll throw them under the bus at the first possible opportunity. If they can save a cent, they'll get rid of the jobs tomorrow. They know this. You think that would put them in our camp, make them ideal recruitment material, but they hate us as well. Unfortunately, that's because the trust, both by the opposition but also by ourselves, has in large part been undermined. To give you a nice illustration, trust is obviously a little bit more than just asking for trust. It needs to be demonstrated, and it requires vulnerability from those who have power over others. To give an illustration of this, there was a protest, the IMARC protests at the start of 2020, again, before the virus and the lockdown and so forth, and just after the fires. This was an incredibly targeted event. This was at a convention center. It was well away from the public for the most part, and it was specifically targeting a convention, IMARC convention, of mining executives and fossil fuel companies. And it got a fairly intense police reaction. Still not quite up there with some of the other stuff we saw in 2020, but at the same time, this was full on. For Australia, this was about as, well, for Australia in as metropolitan area, this was about as serious as it gets. That's not blood, incidentally, just in case anyone was worried, but nonetheless, overwhelming police force. right? Now, not to say that the protesters were behaving well, but that's kind of the point. The point, nonetheless, is that the police response was overwhelming. Interestingly, contrast this with the Extinction Rebellion protests, which were happening at about the same time. These protests were happening in the CBD. They were huge, huge, even by our standards. Not quite up with the Iraq War protests, which still hold the record, but very, very large. And the police presence for this was incredibly passive. They just showed up, they guided around. Now, in fairness, this protest did have a permit where the other one didn't. But at the same time, if you thought there was going to be a time for the state to intervene into a protest, surely it's this. This locked down the CBD for a solid 3 hours, not to mention the traffic chaos that happened afterwards. So why is it that the government reacted so strongly to that very small and targeted IMARC protest versus this massive disruption of the CBD? Well, this protest focused around mining executives. The public doesn't care about mining executives. In other words, it hit the mark. It went after exactly the right audience. It inconvenienced them and it upset them and it got some good press. State can't be having that. Compare it to this. Why didn't the state care about this? They found another way of sabotaging. Specifically, they went it's still vaguely impressed with the amount of effort that went into this. They went car to car of every piece of traffic that was held up by these protests. Legal protests with a permit, no doubt, until they found someone with a sob story. Specifically, this lady who was grieving after her mother had died about a few weeks prior, 2 days prior, and her dad had passed a few months prior, who had just gone from picking up her stuff and is now stuck in traffic and trying to get back home. Now, the funny thing is if you look at that objectively and you sort of go like, well, I mean, yeah, it's inconvenient, but it's not like you were rushing to a hospital bed, was it? It's not. I mean, yeah, I can understand why that would be upsetting, but what's this got to do with protest? I mean, as opposed to a traffic jam? But they found a way of sabotaging it, didn't they? They leveraged that psychological power. Now, did this work? Maybe, maybe not, but it made the more overwhelming police response less necessary. What this sort of illustrates is something that we have strayed into in the past. There's a tendency for us to inconvenience the wrong people. If we're inconveniencing the general public, well, what do you think that's going to do to their relationship with us? Raising awareness is important, very important, but particularly in Australia, and I can't speak for other countries, but in Australia, there's a 79% approval rating for action on climate change. It's not a lack of agreement. So what are we protesting the public for, right? What this is about is getting specific action out of the parliamentarians. And when their mining buddies are getting really, really upset with them, well, managing upwards, on the other hand, dealing with more powerful individuals, this is where that psychological power that I keep bringing up really comes to its fore. Because once again, there is that tendency to surrender psychological power to those who are more powerful than us just because they're more powerful. Understanding the motivations, needs, and interests of managers and others in a more powerful position than us, MPs or members of parliament or Congress people or other people, on an individual level, gives us leverage. You might not have structural control over these people, sure, but those are just the less sophisticated forms of power, aren't they? Structure, rules, hierarchy, finance. But information technology and psychology are a lot more up for grabs. Unfortunately, we've largely handed those away. Document the hell out of everything, always, especially if you're in a conflict with a more powerful party, and kill your demons and your angels. There is a tendency, once again, for us to view more powerful people than us as otherworldly, both for better or worse. There's a tendency to view organizations like Ted Cruz or our equivalents over here as demons, like nearly otherworldly evil people, right? Even the word evil itself sort of evokes something beyond human, right? Terrifying monoliths of power. They're just people, right? And subject to exactly the same influences as you can exert over anyone else. It's harder to get to them, sure, but they're just people. And the inverse goes the same. And as someone who participated in this, our celebration of certain leaders in this space or certain figureheads in this space sometimes doesn't do us any favors. Al Gore, for example, was turned into a bit of a patron saint of this topic and then proceeded to fly everywhere in a private jet, which was used very effectively against us when it came to the public debate. And we didn't want to criticize him, did we? because we didn't want to criticize the movement. But that's imagining the dude as an avatar of the movement as opposed to just a guy. He's just a dude, right? He's just a person and needs to be dealt with accordingly. There's, again, this horrible tendency to just sort of hand over our psychological power to people who are leading the movement just because they're leading the movement. To expand on this a little bit, good faith, bad faith engagement is another element to this, in terms of just to give you some really practical, tangible tools for this sort of thing. Looking at the distinction between disingenuousness and a power concentration gives us 4 fundamentally different approaches to engagement with a campaign. So starting with someone who's engaging in good faith. Now, these are all people that we disagree with. Every single one of these 4 is people that we disagree with, because, you know, if you're talking to people you agree with, who cares, right? Good faith engagement, but low power engagement. These people need protection, really, more than anything else. They need to be protected and they need to be served. Like, this is your grandma on my occasion, or in my personal example, or family members or friends of friends who don't have any real influence over all this sort of thing, but also don't really get what's going on. Like, empathy is an incredibly valuable approach here, and protection to a large part. I mean, again, think about the climate change denial motivator. Fear. I mean, you're scared, horribly scared of this potential future, and it's safer from a psychological perspective to retreat into denial. This is hardly unprecedented behavior for a human being. What they don't have is safety, emotional safety, to be able to engage in this campaign. We can provide that. We had to deal with it, didn't we? We can guide them towards that, but to do that, we need to see what they need. Conversion is entirely possible with this group. Note that even with good faith engagement, however, a higher powered individual doesn't get the same tolerance, because they're less accountable for their decision making and have a higher impact here. This is sort of your Al Gore sort of situation here. Now, he's on our side nominally, but he keeps screwing up. And similarly, anyone with a high degree of influence who is engaging in good faith, is genuine, disagrees with us, but is trying to engage in good faith, wants to have the conversation, isn't just trying to push propaganda or anything like this. Accountability is required, unfortunately. It would be nice to be able to convert them. And if you can get a line of access to them to do so, brilliant. But a lot of the time you can't, because they can use that power to remove critics from their sphere. In this case, they need to be held accountable. If that means removing them from the platform, so be it. Ideally, because it is still good faith engagement, education should be enough. But we have to be aware that that power concentration fundamentally alters this. Just because they're trying, just because they're not being inherently in bad faith here, doesn't mean they get away without accountability. They have a concentration of power. They're dangerous if they're wrong. Inversely, looking at bad faith engagement, which is but low power concentration, we're sort of talking your internet troll here, or someone that wants to own the libs, as the phrase goes, but doesn't actually have any degree of influence in society. This is tricky. A lot of the time, this is best dealt with by just ignore them, just disengage. It's not worth the trouble. That's it. And conversion is still possible in this sort of environment, provided that you can build a relationship with them first. There's no point trying to change their mind unless a relationship is built, because you won't be able to negotiate them out of that bad faith engagement until they trust you to some degree. That said, sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes it is necessary to counter this bad narrative. And that largely comes down to seizing the narrative. Now, this is where we start to get into the darker side of what we're talking about here, because what that would involve is basically hounding them out of the platform or swamping them. Now, a lot of the time, mockery is the way to go with this. Overwhelming them with simplified messages, or mockery, or shaming them, or anything essentially that gets them off, kills their narrative and replaces it with your own. Now, as you're no doubt completely aware, this is not something we do, or it's not something we agree with. It's not something that we embrace. It's something that we tend to fly from, which means that we lose. I mean, Donald Trump was more or less elected on the basis of memes, in bad faith engagement online. That's where his base came from. I mean, this Q thing, for God's sake, that's exactly what this is. It's just narrative. It's false narrative, but they don't care. That's not even a vague attempt to engage with reality. It's propaganda. It's low-grade propaganda, but there's a lot of it. And finally, we come around with this one: bad faith, high power engagement. Do not engage in good faith. Do not even attempt. This is the head of the snake, and it needs to be removed with total prejudice. Once again, they go low, we go high. Nope. Maybe with good faith engagement. With bad faith, high power engagement, what you were talking about here, particularly when it comes to something like climate change, is proactive advocacy for climate change to occur. This person is a systemic risk for human survival. They're advocating for it. Accountability with prejudice. Saying I've started to bandy around quite a lot is that powerful people don't get the benefit of the doubt. You can't afford to give them the benefit of the doubt because they're dangerous if they're wrong. Right? Now, if they're engaging in good faith, there is still room for negotiation and accountability in there, and correction and conversion. But bad faith, high power engagement needs to be removed with prejudice. Cancel culture is a term that's gone around, essentially where you seek to remove the person from the platform rather than engage with them on their ideas. I don't agree with that in terms of good faith engagement. I think it does more harm than good, and I especially don't agree with it with good faith, low-powered engagement. There's been too many examples of it being used against low-powered individuals. It's just not a good tool for that sort of thing. But absolutely, high-powered, bad faith engagement, deplatform them. Go after their advertisers. Go after the code of conduct. Go after their platforms directly. Go after anything and anyone that will remove them from the platform. They do not deserve it. No one has an entitlement to power. Everyone has an entitlement to freedom of speech, because freedom of speech is about the expression and discussion of ideas. But you do not have the right to a platform, especially when you're wrong and know that you're wrong. No one's entitled to be wrong. Big lesson here is that perhaps the biggest one for the environment field is that we need to learn to play dirty, which is not to say that we need to advocate for unethical courses of action. It needs to be that we need to understand that if we keep playing nice, we lose, which is worse. Progressives are fantastic at ethics, and we're absolutely terrible at power. We are atrocious at it, in large part because we give up options. We surrender options. We will not allow ourselves to use certain tactics because they're wrong. I'm an ethicist. I know what's right and wrong. Few people better qualified. And I'm telling you right now that the use of these power tactics, provided that they're in the interests of such an overwhelmingly positive goal and they're kept under control and targeted correctly, they're definitely ethical because they work. I'm something of a consequentialist though. So, some people would disagree with them. We need to replace that they go low, we go high approach with they go low, we kick them in the teeth. Because why not? Hold them accountable for the reality of their actions. I don't think that's a particularly high bar to be, or radical idea, but in practice it often is, because that means not applying mercy, not giving them the benefit of the doubt. It means calling it what it is. Especially when you catch this in the much broader context of what we're trying to achieve here. The worst case scenarios for climate change by 2050 involve mass collapse of ecosystems, mass death. I mean, is there anything that couldn't be justified in that scheme of things, really? I mean, obviously we should be aiming for the highest benefit and the minimum cost in whatever approach we approach. But honestly, when the cost is this large, just about anything could be justified, frankly. The question is what works, which needs to be as much a consideration with us as what are we trying to achieve and is it right? So I'll skip over that because that's not particularly relevant. But I mean, a good example here from bad faith engagement. Peter Dutton is our Minister for Net Border Security, which again, a wonderful export to your country, Terry, from ours, was that whole locking up of refugees thing. We did that, we pioneered that. Wonderful. Unbelievable. We've been doing it for so long too. This man runs concentration camps for refugees that come into our country via boat. Apparently, it's not a problem when they come via plane, only if it's via boat. I don't know why. And they're intentionally kept in bad conditions as a means of scaring away future refugees by boat, which is heinous in its own right, right? But there was several accusations of rape inside those environments, and our Minister for Border Security turned around and said that they were saying that as a means of getting attention, which is about the most unethical thing I can imagine. I mean, if you had to ask me to come up with the least ethical course of action in that situation, I don't even think I could have thought this up. We should have buried him with this. We should have absolutely buried him. We should have called him a rapist. Why not? It's not accurate. So this is what I'm talking about with high-powered bad faith engagement. He knows this isn't right. He doesn't care. It works. We should have buried him and never stopped burying him. He should never have been able to get another job for the rest of his life. Should have ended up on welfare. We should never, zero tolerance is what I'm saying for this sort of thing. We cannot afford mercy to people like this. Once again, what we're ultimately talking about here is we want to go for this collaborative approach. We want to go for this collaborative approach, but that needs security to be able to do that. Specifically, that option for betrayal, let alone the reward for betrayal, needs to be removed from the table. That's our job, both inside our organizations, but also when we develop campaigns to go after those that are doing the wrong thing. Conversion, obviously, is ideal, but so is censure if we have to do it. Remember our various sources of power and how they interrelate in terms of effectiveness and reliability. We really do need to be able to draw on all of them. Or at least, and again, this is a value of collaboration, is that by working with others, you can't specialize in all of these as an individual. Simply impossible. You'll split your attention at the very best. But collaboration means that you can source specialist skills, right? And we often do. I mean, security guards are a perfect example of that sourcing of specialist skills to protect against force, right? You'll see the same thing in protests with marshals, right? People that are keeping an eye on the protest to make sure nothing gets out of control and everything's guided correctly. But emphasize that psychological component because it is so poorly understood and so poorly operationalized. That's a massive opportunity for us. For less powerful groups and less powerful individuals, that psychological power is an untapped resource. We have so much of it, and we often forget about it, both over others, but also over ourselves. Once again, as a nice little illustration, would you bow for the Queen? It's not so much whether you would or you would not, it's the reasons why. And the fact that every single person I've asked about that has immediately had a bit of a crisis, because it does tend to illustrate some fairly scary things about our own mental space. We don't know why we'd bow for the Queen. We just know that we probably would, but there are reasons in there. But unpacking those and being able to articulate them will give you a huge amount of ability to then change your response, or at least know why you would do what you do and why it's the correct approach. I mean, speaking from the ethics perspective, one of the more terrifying realities is that oftentimes when I talk to people about what are your code of ethics, they definitely have them. The codes of ethics is just a means of making decisions. They make decisions all the time, so they have ethics. But people can't tell me what they are beyond, a couple of words of, like honesty, integrity, yada, yada. But you ask people to unpack that in any degree of detail, they have no idea. It's not to say that the detail isn't there, but not being able to articulate it makes you so vulnerable to abuse. Again, that tire being another wonderful example of that. And finally, just to specifically unpack this factor of anger. Anger fundamentally is often seen as a bad thing, right? Being angry is bad. It's certainly not healthy, I'll give you that. But on the other hand, it's often described as immoral. And you'll often see this in certain progressive sections, right? People will describe it as fundamentally immoral behavior, right? You shouldn't be angry, it's bad. It drives bad actions. Fundamentally, anger is just a rejection of the state of things and a demand for change. I am angry because things aren't living up to my expectations, and therefore I expect them to change. That's not a bad thing. Can be valid and invalid, and obviously that's a question of ethics and evidence. We need to make sure that we're correct before we get angry and passionate about changing the world to meet our vision. I mean, it's worth noting that even the QAnon cultists are very angry for exactly the same reason. They're just wrong. This can also separately be effective or ineffective. And that's a question of power. Anger is a tool. If we're using the tool, that's great. If the tool is using us, definitely not. Definitely not good. You don't want to be out of control, right? Losing control to the tool that you're employing is a bad idea. Having worked in carpentry, Terry, you've probably seen some very graphic examples of that in practice. Tools should serve us, not the other way around. So some takeaways here. Power is not ethics. Ethics are a means of deciding what the right and wrong thing to do is, but power is whether or not we can achieve that. Power is complex and dynamic from those 7 different sources, always in play, always moving. Collaboration is ideal, but competition is a reality and it can't be eliminated. You cannot get rid of that competitive element. Be good at both. At least, even if you don't want to be competitive, you need to be making sure then that there's means to limit and control that competition. Psychological power is often neglected. Make use of it. And finally, no one has a right to power. You have a right to rights. You have a right to ethics. You have a right to be treated well. You have a right to certain things in your life, quality of life, I would argue, well beyond what's legally required, I should say. But no one has a right to power. The more power a person has, the less accountability they tend to have. And that's inverse to the way things need to be. They need more accountability for how they conduct themselves, not less. Powerful people, as a result, don't get excuses. They don't get the benefit of the doubt, or mercy. They do not get mercy. If they don't like that, they can give up the power because no one has a right to power. It's strictly optional. If the President of the United States doesn't like being subject to an overwhelming degree of scrutiny and accountability, then they don't have to be the President of the United States. If the Prime Minister of Australia similarly doesn't like it, retire. You lose nothing. Well, you lose plenty, but you know, the power comes with responsibilities. It must. If it currently doesn't, then we need to make sure that they get introduced. If you're looking for specific actions, and Terry, this is probably a little less specifically relevant for you. We have a thing called superannuation over here, where we have a compulsory contribution from our wages into a sort of call it a pension fund, but it goes into the stock market, right? FE, this might be a bit more directly relevant to you. People forget that they have a huge amount, especially later in life, huge volume of money in the stock market, and they've got absolutely no idea where it is most of the time. They just sort of let it happen. It goes out to whatever super fund that you've got allocated by your employer, usually, maybe by yourself. It's incredibly easy to switch super funds because that money is funding something. And a lot of the time, because unfortunately they do tend to be good investments, if nothing else, fossil fuels. You'll often find that the money's in fossil fuels. You'll often find it's in tobacco or gambling for that matter as well, depending on whether those are issues you care about as well. Looking into where the money is invested and making choices to invest it into ethical funds inside your existing super fund, or moving it to another fund such as Australian Ethical or Future Super, which are both Australian companies. I'm not paid to advocate for them, incidentally. I just think they're really good. Is a really simple thing to do, and it's very easy, frankly. I mean, it's your money. Right? It should be funding things you care about. Immediately makes a massive financial difference. Exercising that power form of money, and you might not have it liquid, you might not have access to money in your day-to-day life, but if you've got a pension fund, it's sitting there waiting, and that money's invested somewhere. And that's me. So I hope you all had a good time, and sorry for just talking so constantly towards the end there, but I was worried about running out of time. The books is available and all that sort of thing as well. I'll send a follow-up email with the slides so you can access all of those, and I'll include a link to the book and all of that. If you're in Australia, I can get you a copy of the book with no shipping fee. Terry, the good news is the book is available in the US. It is published in the US, so that it's actually cheaper for you to get it than it is here. But that's enough talking from me. So what I'm going to do is drop the screen and hand over to you. I'm also going to stop recording at this point.